Hello, and thanks for joining us. My name's Ian Stroud.
And my name's David Malone, and this is Hyperland. So Ian, because of Israel and Gaza, suddenly Ukraine's dropped away, and I thought, maybe now's a good time to talk about Ukraine, because all of the self-appointed experts are sort of no longer paying attention. So,
I mean, it was interesting because I had a friend come and stay for a few days, and he sort of said, I've not heard anything about Ukraine in weeks. And I went, well, I have every day. But I go and look for it, sadly. And
you visited Ukraine, didn't you? You've been there. I never have been.
I stayed about a week in Yalta, and then I went down to Sevastopol.
When was this?
2012. So it was 2 years. It was 2014. Putin annexed the Crimea.
Yeah.
I went there because there's so much history there. You had the Yalta Conference in 1945 with Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin sitting around dividing up what was left. And then I think it's Chekhov lived there.
Oh, right. Okay. I didn't know.
Right. And his house is there. And then you also had George of the Light Brigade. You had Sevastopol, which was sort of up and coming, sort of quite... I thought at the time it felt as if there was quite a European influence in...
There has been, yeah.
Sevastopol. I mean, and of course you've got the Russian sea fleet.
Well, that's I think an important point. Yeah, I mean it's the home of a large part of Russia's nuclear fleet.
But the other interesting thing that I found when I went there, people spoke Russian in Crimea.
Yeah,
they didn't speak Ukrainian.
Well, I mean, for me, I wanted to talk about it because I think the analysis, if one can do violence to the word analysis, of what we're being offered by most of the pundits and the main media outlets, just seems to be extremely one-sided, narrow, and self-serving. It's rare that you read something which seems to take a step back from advertising right at the start that Putin's a terrible man and Russia just needs to be contained, and the poor Ukrainians, as if that was it. I mean, those things are true, but the great mistake is not being misled and coming up with the wrong idea. The huge problem is thinking that part of the answer is the whole answer.
Yeah.
And that's what bothers me. I just, it's partly just, where do you start your analysis? Because where you start it will largely dictate the outcome. Like, to make a silly version, if you started an analysis of World War II on D-Day, ridiculous as it sounds, but the analysis would go, here we were on the continent, us Germans and our French friends and our Dutch and Belgian friends, and we were largely, delivering the milk, the trains were running on time. We'll gloss over all the unpleasant things that we were doing, but there we were, largely in a state of peace.
All right.
And then, out of the clear blue sky, America and American troops and England, neither of which have a reason to be on the continent, come sailing across the channel, armed to the teeth, and stop shelling the shit out of us. How unfair is that? Well, they invaded us.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a ridiculous scenario, because you only need to wind back a few months, let alone a few years, and the whole story looks different. But I can't get around the fact that stupid way of framing it is largely what's going on in most discussions that I've read about the Ukraine.
Yeah.
There's a huge backstory. You only need to go back, say, 2008 to suddenly get a much fuller picture.
Well, I'd sort of say just going back to 2014, because a lot of people, even in the news today, don't take it back that far.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, look, I want to go back a bit further, but even if we start in 2014, in the headlines would have been about Donbass separatists. These are ethnic Russians who had decided that they wanted to be separate from Ukraine because in the Donbass, for Stalinist historical reasons, there was a huge number. I'm not even sure if it was at least the large minority in the Donbass. It might even be a majority.
Yeah.
They were ethnic Russian people living there.
Yeah.
You can say, well, They were moved in by a terrible dictator called Stalin. They could just bloody well move right back out again. They got no business being there.
Are we talking about Crimea?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, so you go further back and you've got
longer.
Yeah, you got the Turks, you've got the Greeks, you've got, there's some wonderful Greek remains on the coast.
But I mean, just talking before we go back to ancient history, the Donbass, there were lots of Russians, and in 2014 they said we want to be separate.
Yeah.
Okay. Much like, let me see. Yeah, okay. You can see where I could go with this. We've got lots of separatists, two different separatist groups in Spain who say, no, we're just different from you lot. We want to be separate.
Yeah.
And some of those groups would go, oh, yeah, they should be separate. And in 2014, there were soldiers being sent off from Kiev to fight the Donbass separatists.
Yeah.
And at that time, the papers were also quite full of how some of the armed parts of the Ukraine military were proper out-and-out card-carrying. Hitler was a great person. It was quite right to gas the Jews, fascists.
Yeah.
They were there.
Yeah.
There were 2 brigades of them. And, there were telegrams sent to the US State Department saying as much, saying, these are really dodgy people.
Yeah.
So that's even if you go back to 2014. But I would say you've got to go back further. Go back to 2008. 2008, it's declared by the Americans and NATO, Ukraine is going to be part of NATO.
Yeah.
And that was at the time, Angela Merkel, the head of Germany at the time, she said, and this is a quote, I was very sure that Putin was not going to just let that happen. From his perspective, that would be a declaration of war. That's Angela Merkel saying that. And, the US ambassador in Moscow in April 2008, he wrote to Condoleezza Rice, who was then Secretary of State, and he wrote, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, brackets, not just Putin, close brackets. In more than 2.5 years of conversations, that's the US ambassador saying this, with key Russian players, I've yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests.
Yeah.
So everyone was aware that this is a really provocative thing. And, it's essentially, America has its Monroe Doctrine, which says that no distant great power is allowed to station military forces in America's backyard. So when Russia tried it in Cuba, we came close to a nuclear war.
Yeah.
When we talked about this in the Chile thing, when it looked like a left-wing socialist government under Allende was going to run to power, they were very clear, we're not going to allow this to happen. This is America's backyard. This is our national interest. And so they overthrew him.
Yeah.
Simple as that. When you have a left-wing government in Venezuela, same thing. Economic warfare, sanctions, got to get rid of him. When you had Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So America's very clear that any incursion of an ideology in its backyard, even something as far away as bloody Chile, which is in the Southern Hemisphere, and they feel quite within their rights to go, no, not only does this other great foreign power not have a right, but even the self-determination of the people of that country, we feel morally that we're empowered to just overthrow it. And then they think, right on Russia's border, let's make this power a member of NATO. And they included it in all of the military games. I mean, they couldn't have got any clearer about the fact they were now going to make Ukraine part of NATO, arm it with NATO weapons, have it in a mutual pact, and it's right there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a historical fact that Putin then spent several years, this dreadful Putin man, who, they've got this notion that Putin wants to take over the world.
Yeah.
Invade every country. There's no evidence for this apart from what happened in Ukraine. But, he did try various diplomatic means. They were all turned down. And the clearest one was Russia sent letters on the 17th of December, 2021, sent a letter to President Biden and another copy of it to NATO. And it said, would the America and NATO give a written undertaking that Ukraine would not join NATO and instead be a neutral state? just make it a neutral state. And if you say Ukraine is going to be a neutral state like Switzerland, we'll sign up to it as well. So he's making, it's on record that he was trying diplomatic means.
Yeah.
And then Anthony Blinken, who was the Secretary of State, just wrote back saying, there's no change, there will be no change.
Yeah.
In other words, sod off.
Yeah.
And a month later, Putin invades.
Yeah, and Putin also sort of said he wouldn't invade. So what Putin says and what Putin does, two different things.
And I'm not going to defend Putin, but he said, I'm not going to invade. But then there's when he seeks some kind of compromise and gets a sod off.
Yeah. Then yes.
Is it completely in a realpolitik way unreasonable for him to go, okay, then that doesn't leave me with any
other choice? Yeah.
I mean, his alternative is to just roll over and say, sure, have an armed NATO ally right on my border. And as I've said, there's a long history of America feeling that it's perfectly fine for them to have armed intervention when something like that is even as far away as Chile.
Yeah.
So this is not to say, oh, so Putin's a lovely man. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying our analysis completely leaves out and whitewashes all the evidence which helped you to understand why Putin did what he did. And instead, what's substituted for it is, he's just a megalomaniac who wants to invade everyone.
Yeah.
Which is just not. I mean, in 2008, when they did that, they didn't need to contain a militarily strong, aggressive Russia. In 2008, Russia was on its knees.
Yeah.
They didn't need to do that at all. Yeah. So it's an unprovoked, provocative. It just looks like to me that we wanted a war in Ukraine. That there's a big bear which wasn't feeling very well, and we did everything we could. We poked it with as many sharp sticks as we could, and then when it said, "You know what? Fuck you," this terrible aggressive bear.
Yeah, I'm part of the way with you. I don't think the West is probably a better description in terms of what's happened as opposed to just pointing the finger at the United States. I think it's but this is one of the reasons that I'm I'm unsure about talking about it, because actually you need to go back. Funnily, I mentioned the Yalta Conference in 1945. Part of what Putin was sort of saying was, and there's an argument over the not 1 inch further east NATO go, and there are people that claim that was promised, and there's other people, and there was documents that came out about whether this had been part of the promise. And if it had been a promise, then certainly it has moved east. But then I've heard other people describe it, and there was no explicit promise. So I mean,
maybe there was a promise where I think it's really interesting that one could delve into that, and from a Russian diplomatic point of view, that would be important. But even if there was no promise, moving NATO right up into Ukraine, is that making Europe safer? No. Was it making the Ukrainian people safer? Well, there would certainly be an argument that side would make, but the evidence on the ground is it's killed a lot of Ukrainians, actually.
But then what we know now in terms of the history between Russia and Georgia, for example, you'd sort of say, well, they were pretty aggressive there. I don't want to just point the finger at the West and go, they're terrible and hypocritical, because look at all the wars they've been involved in. When does it start? When do we draw a line and sort of say, right, okay, let's tell the story from today. I mean, how does it end?
I personally think it will end the way it was always going to end, which is with Ukraine divided. I think as soon as the aggression started, I thought, okay, all the major players had something to gain by having a new Cold War and a country with an iron curtain through the middle of it.
Yeah.
Because it means that all of the arms people in Russia and all of the arms people in the West the money train will start running again, and we need tanks and we need missiles and we need military bases. And from a capital point of view, that's just good news.
Yeah.
Everybody's happy with that. I mean, the defense industry took a real hit when the wall came down. Well, I mean, it sounds callous to say it, but it is the fact of the matter. And so all of those people would be thrilled to have a new Cold War and a new Iron Curtain. And it seemed to me that that's what would be the end game. And I think it is where it will end. I think there's already been all kinds of noises made and kites flown about, we will have to have a diplomatic settlement with Russia, and we have to tell the Ukrainians they can't have everything back. And I think that is what will happen, and Zelensky will be thrown under the bus if he's not. I mean, we've not been, neither Russia nor Europe nor America have been at all worried about helping there be regime changes in 3 or 4, where someone who was elected president then gets ousted, and you can see it, with Tymoshenko, you can see it with Yanukovych. I mean, depending on who they offended, they weren't long in power, and I think it would be the same way. In part because I just cannot see Russia ever agreeing to give up the home base of its nuclear fleet.
Well, it's moved a lot of it, to be fair.
Yeah, it has.
I think a lot of it.
Having a base.
Sochi, south of Sochi, I think they've moved.
Yes, yeah, because they don't want to be blockaded in.
Yeah,
and maybe Russia will back down, but I wouldn't take that bet at the moment. And
it's why I wasn't keen to.
But I don't know why you're not keen. Just because we can't come up with an answer doesn't mean that we shouldn't discuss it. I mean, if a discussion has an easy answer, that's the discussion you don't want to bother with.
Yeah,
it's boring.
Yeah.
What the interesting discussions are the ones which are complicated. And what bothers me is when what's offered to us is a moronically dumbed down, self-serving analysis, and that's fed to us every day.
Yeah,
and that bothers the hell out of me.
That becomes more.
I want to have the complicated analysis where it's not clear,
because
that's the world.
Yeah, the information's out there, but you need to go and look for it, as opposed to any of the big media platforms actually spelling it out for you. I thought Reuters did quite a good job explaining the history of Palestine and Israel, and you can reflect the same narrative sidings there.
Oh, God, yes. Well, I mean, yes, you're right. The same complications of who was where first and who did what to whom and when do you start the analysis. Yeah, I mean, I agree. But come on. Can we just be shot for one political faux pas at a time here?
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to make enough people angry talking about Ukraine in ways that haven't been sanctioned by the powers that be without also getting into that. I mean, we can do it later if you're really feeling suicidal, but do we have to do it right now? Can we just get shot for one crime at a time? Do you mind?
Well, okay. In terms of Putin, I would sort of say there's been different ways of looking at it. I think the people that are supportive of Putin and the Kremlin and what's happening there are supportive because they've been fed the same bullshit that we get fed.
I'm not supportive of Putin.
No.
Just because I don't accept the standard Western narrative doesn't mean that I go, so then I accept. I mean, that's kind of rhetorical ploy is just stupid, and I refuse to be part of it. And I think that the Russian media, state media, is feeding the Russians nonsense, and I think our versions of state media are feeding us nonsense.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like I have to choose between one lot of nonsense and another. I prefer to try and find my own analysis, and it will be less conclusive and less clear cut. But that is actually reality.
Okay, well, you sent me some clips.
I did, and the reason for it is I think you can see that there's a long-standing American foreign policy view, which was there in the Cold War, and when I listened to it, I think to myself, I can hear that it's the same. That I get the strong feeling those same sentiments are alive and well and being applied to Russia now. And also it raises when we talk about when did the war start, the shooting war started recently, but the economic war has been going on for a while,
right?
And I think that needs to be.
Well, that you could put the argument of the not an inch further east, along with a financial war to better understand, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. So look, I think you managed to get hold of them. These are from a film called First Strike. So it was a documentary about mutually assured destruction and the whole business of the
It takes me back.
nuclear deterrent. So the first clip, I think, is a man called Paul Nitze, Nitze, who was the representative of the Secretary of Defense to the SALT Treaty. The SALT was one of the big disarmament treaties, and he was in that position 1969 to 1974. And he's talking about the Soviets and what he thinks they're after.
The reason it's important that they not have in their mind that they might succeed in such an attack has to do with what their ambitions are. What is it that they really would like to achieve? They would like to separate the United States from its European allies. They would like to neutralize and circle communist China. They would like to expand their influence and get to a position of control over the Persian Gulf. If they control the Persian Gulf, then they can dictate where the energy supplies of the Persian Gulf go. That will support their policy of dividing European NATO from the United States.
Okay, he's talking about the Soviets, but the same analysis is going to be true for Russia. And they're saying they want to control the Persian Gulf. Okay, for Persian Gulf, read energy supplies to Europe.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that has morphed into Russia exporting gas to Europe, which the Americans have always hated because they think this is a clear way of separating NATO and their European allies from America.
Yeah.
And that was really clear. And they're right to some extent because once the end of the Nord Stream, the big pipeline that ran under the Baltic, ended in Germany, this did pivot German foreign policy towards Russia because Germany and Austria in particular really relied on that gas.
Didn't Trump not raise this?
He did, yeah. I mean,
the reliance.
You are determined to get us shot by everyone. All right, look. Trump is is an idiot, but even the idiots, like broken clocks, get something right once a day.
Yeah.
By accident.
Twice a day, mate. Twice a day.
Twice a day. Okay, we're right. Twice a day. All right.
Well, this is a 24-hour clock. Okay.
Bloody hell. So the Americans have always been very, very nervous of Russia having any influence on Europe. And there he's actually talking about Persian Gulf, about energy supplies, and that's exactly what the Nord Stream. There was Nord Stream 1, they talked about Nord Stream 2.
Yeah,
America have never made any bones. They wanted this thing stopped. Right. They tried all kinds of sanctions, and then there was the South Stream, which was supposed to run out of the Caspian Basin. Guess where it would go? Part of it would go through Syria. I mean, this is why I've always felt that the war in Ukraine and the war in Syria.
One of them goes across Ukraine as well, doesn't it? There isn't.
Yeah, that's right. That's why I've always felt that the war in Ukraine and the war in Syria were the same thing. They were just the two different fronts, the north front and the south front of the Great Gas War, which is what I think we're involved in.
Right.
And then remember the pipeline, the Nord Stream gets blown up.
Yeah, that was the Nord Stream 2 was just. I don't think it ever properly got used, did it?
No,
it kind of got.
But they blew up the Nord Stream 1.
Yeah.
And at the time, immediately, it was the Russians that blew it up. Yeah. Why Russians would blow up its own pipeline always seemed slightly obscure to me, but everyone was certain.
And this was off the coast of Denmark, wasn't it?
Yeah, because Guardian was certain, the New York Times was certain, everyone was certain, and of course, then you had. The great American investigative journalist who was involved in Watergate and who made the big piece saying, actually, I think maybe the Russians were not the perpetrators of this. I think it might have been the Americans. And everyone suddenly poo-pooed this great American journalist as if, he's an idiot. I mean, he hadn't been an idiot for the previous 40 years, but suddenly he was an idiot.
Yeah.
But then, of course, it's come out then. I mean, I'm just looking at something from the New York Intelligence Journal. There's a whole bunch of New York Times even. And they're saying, actually now the US was informed 3 months before the bombing by European intelligence services that Ukraine had planned to use a small team of divers to conduct a covert attack against the Nord Stream, according to US intelligence and documents.
Yeah.
And the Wall Street Journal said the CIA had been tipped off about a plan by the Dutch military intelligence, and the US had actually warned Ukraine not to target the pipelines. It's a replay of when the elements in Chile wanted to get rid of Allende, and the CIA said, no, we don't think that's a good idea, and then they went ahead and tried it anyway. And so it does now look like there's a whole story. It's Herschel Walker, I think. Isn't that right? His name?
Seymour Hersh?
Seymour Hersh, thank you, yeah. Now the Wall Street Journal saying, German investigators have looked at it and they say that actually there was looks like a Ukrainian sabotage team that was operating out of Poland. And my guess is that this would have been an American the technology behind it, and maybe special forces. But when you deploy your special forces, you don't advertise the fact.
No.
You need a cutout. You need them to look like they were somebody else. That's how it works. That's how I've talked to people in the SAS, and they're clear. When the SAS go in, they never go in because a few months before those soldiers are going to be used, they're always they leave the regiment. So that someone can stand up in Parliament and say, no, we've got no special forces. And then, hey, presto, a little while later, those same soldiers reappear on the roster.
Yeah.
But that's how it works. So there's now lots of evidence which suggests, this was a Western thing to blow up the Nord Stream.
America's certainly supplying a lot more fuel.
Yeah, well, America has its fracking industry, which for a while was on its knees.
Yeah.
And whether, so it certainly wanted to help its own fracking industry. But even without that, America's view is it's a terrible thing for Russia to be supplying vital gas to Europe because it gives them political leverage on Europe.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I can see the realpolitik argument about that. But from a moral point of view, from a sort of we're right and they're terrible people point of view, it's a non-starter because all they're saying is, we don't want Russia to have influence. We want you to be dependent on American gas, so we've got influence. Come on.
Yeah.
So if it can't be a terrible moral thing for Russia to be gaining some political influence by supplying gas if Americans think it's perfectly morally fine for them to supply gas and have political influence.
Yeah.
And I just want there to be a clearer, less blinkered and self-serving analysis, because otherwise how should the rest of us make any sense of it?
Yeah.
And decide for ourselves. And I refuse to be corralled like some kind of sheep into a stupid point of view. No, I just resent that. Can you play the second clip?
Yeah, sure.
Which is from the same film. This is James Schlesinger, who was the Secretary of Defense under Nixon from 73 to 75. Nixon and Ford, therefore. And he was in the same film talking about the same thing, this sort of the Americans' view of Soviet foreign policy and their own foreign policy.
The rest of the world has recognized that since 1945, the balance of power has been maintained by the United States. None of our allies, the former great powers like Britain, Germany, are in a position to do that. Only the United States has the power to serve as a counterweight to the Soviet Union. And as our military capacity has flagged, and more importantly, as we have been perceived to be vacillating on foreign policy issues, our allies and the third world nations have begun to make adjustments in their position. They have begun to consider accommodations with the Soviet Union, and as a consequence, our position worldwide can deteriorate rapidly, even in the absence of an attack on the United States directly.
Okay, well, there you go. So there's the Secretary of State for Defense saying that we've been seen to be vacillating, and the consequence of this is even our allies, let alone just other states, are beginning to think, well, maybe we should deal with the Soviets. So just apply the same logic, and my suspicion is that same logic, and things haven't changed in Washington and the corridors of power and Pentagon, that they're saying, yeah, we can't be seen to be vacillating about allowing Russia to get power, have influence on European states, and we need to take decisive action, because unless we do, our power will decline, even without there being a necessary attack. Yeah. So I think that begins to explain why America has waged economic warfare on Russia. So set aside Mr. Putin. Let's just imagine that it was someone lovely, just so that we don't have this kind of, but it was Mr. Putin. Yeah. Let's just take the point of view of Russian citizens who work in Russian gas companies and the owners of the Russian gas companies. And there they are in allegedly a free market, working hard every day, extracting gas, putting it in a pipeline, and saying to the rest of the world, we've got gas. Do you need gas? Great. Would you like to buy some of our gas? Here you go. Sell it. And that's what they were doing. And I don't see that that's some kind of, we're trying to take over the world. No. According to the doctrine of free trade, that was an actor in the free market offering goods and services which to people who wanted it, and then saying, great, here you go, we'll sell it to you. Yeah. And what America made very clear is that they wanted to stop that. They tried everything they could to try and get other countries, especially European countries, to not buy that gas, to put sanctions on. They opposed the Nord Stream. They bitterly opposed Nord Stream 2. And from my point of view, they started 2 wars just to cut those pipelines, one in Ukraine and one in Syria. Yeah. Because the coincidence of timing seems at least something you should take note of. And if you're Russia, just Russian citizens, aren't you going to feel like we're just trying to make a living here, selling our resources on the world, and this other country is stopping us? They're not dropping bombs on us, but they're making it so that I'll lose my job and I'll lose my income. Yeah. And my family will be poor because I'm just trying to sell gas and they don't like it. But instead of going in the free market, well, we'll sell our gas cheaper, or, our gas is red, white, and blue and sings a little song for you. Yeah. They just go, no, we're just going to try all kinds of bullying tactics to stop you being an actor in the free market. Is that not economic warfare? Is it?
It is, but I then ask myself, well, why did Putin come out and sort of say we're denazifying Ukraine? Why did Putin come out and sort of say, you promised not another inch east? Why didn't he just come out and sort of say what you've just said?
I don't know. I mean, maybe he did in the corridors of power. I have no idea. Yeah. I mean, I have to say, even if he did say that, I really doubt that NBC, CBS, The Guardian, and the New York Times.
It doesn't matter about them, and it matters more to the Russian people.
Yeah. I don't know.
That's what I think was the narrative that they were being told.
Yeah. Well, maybe.
But again, I might be wrong.
No, but even if that, I'm perfectly willing to imagine that Putin was as stupid as our leaders and said, yeah, the way I can rally my people is by giving them some narrative that shows that, those dastardly people in the West made a promise when we had saved them from the Nazis and laid down millions of our lives. What was it? Russia lost 21 million people or something?
Yeah, well, when you say Russia, that includes Ukraine.
Okay.
So you
Soviet Union.
And so, Stalin and what Stalin
I can imagine that he might have decided that was a good tactic. I never said he wasn't anything other than stupid.
Who are we talking? Sorry?
No, maybe that is, but I'm not quite sure why you think that's important. I mean, so what? Where's it?
Sorry.
So he didn't point out that there was economic warfare being waged, but there still was.
No, I'm. That's not the point that I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is, why did he you go with the denazification, and
Why do you think?
And NATO said that they wouldn't, and we are being threatened now because the border with NATO's becoming closer and closer. And then the argument is, and NATO doesn't go out and recruit countries. Countries are asking to join. So
Sure.
I agree with you. I think there's a lot that hasn't been said behind the scenes.
In terms of countries wanting to join NATO, you can say the argument, why shouldn't a country that wants to join NATO join? Well, fair enough.
Yeah.
But on a realpolitik, you just go back to, why wasn't it okay for Cuba to say, well, we'd like some Russian missiles from Cuba. It makes us feel safer.
Yeah, totally.
But everyone goes, oh, don't be ridiculous. That's just not realpolitik. Imagine the threat to America.
Yeah.
But we're not willing to make the same kind of real-world analysis when it comes to Ukraine.
That I totally agree with you.
Okay, well, look, can we play the third clip?
Yes.
I mean, none of these are, they're not really changing the argument. I just think they're really interesting to peer back into history. So this one is from a film from 1984. It was done by Lionheart Films.
Yeah.
And it was called Countdown to Looking Glass. Looking Glass was the code name for an all-out American strike. And this is a fictitious presidential address. So these are words written by a Hollywood scriptwriter in 1984. This was, so it's probably written and filmed a couple of years before.
Yeah.
So these were words that an American scriptwriter thought would sound noble and morally correct to an American audience if these words were in the film coming out the mouth of a fictitious American president.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
My fellow Americans, our country is faced today with a serious challenge. We have been asked, as a people, to make a decision so important that how the world evolves, the course it takes for the next century, will almost surely depend on what we decide. As your president, and with the valued counsel of the leaders of the Congress, the National Security Council, and the members of my cabinet, I have made that decision. My decision is to make it absolutely clear to those who would impose unreasonable and crippling restrictions on vital commerce that such restrictions are unacceptable.
Okay, so that is the speech which the scriptwriters put into the mouth of a president when, in the film, the Soviet Union has put unreasonable and crippling restrictions on vital commerce. Yeah. And in 1984, the scriptwriters felt that it would be a story Americans would understand, that the Soviet Union tries to say to America, no, you can't do that economically. We're going to prevent you. We're going to economically cripple you. And in the context of the film, the American president says, okay, we're going to start World War III.
Yeah, yeah.
And this would seem to be a tragic but understandable escalation. Okay, surely that's what the economic warfare America has been waging against Russia was. The imposition of unreasonable and crippling restrictions on vital commerce, i.e. gas.
Yeah.
Which was one of Russia's major sources of foreign currency. Now, you either have to say, we just think Russia and the Russian people and Russia under its present leadership is so heinous that they're not allowed to make a living, and that's a morally right thing to do, and we'll just starve them out. We'll prevent them being part of the global economy. And if you're not willing to say that, then what the hell were you doing?
Yeah.
And according to that film, if Russia had been doing that to America, then the scriptwriters at least thought it would be morally understandable for a Russian president to say, right, I'm pressing the big button. They can't see that a Russian leader, even a horrible one like Putin, might not feel the same way about the imposition of unreasonable and crippling restrictions. That's what the American foreign policy has been.
Yeah.
I agree with you that it is a really complicated situation, but you're not going to get any clarity if you just listen to the idiotic, one-sided nonsense that's been portrayed in our newspapers.
And I clearly don't.
No, you don't. But
Yeah.
but they continue to write this. I mean, it's been so appalling, right down to a sort of a rehash of World War One, where the Ukrainians were going to win, and it was all going to be over in a matter of months. And the Ukrainians have been on the verge of crushing Russia from the very beginning of the war, and they're still there.
Yeah.
I think like sending all the boys off in 1914. Yes, we'll be in Berlin by Christmas and home for the New Year.
Yeah.
And you thought, I've heard this story before, and unfortunately, I think a lot of people went along with it, or they didn't seem appalled by it.
Well,
the result is that lots of Ukrainians have lost their lives.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it's a morally wonderful thing for Putin to say, we're keeping the Donbass and we're keeping Sevastopol, and it's certainly not okay for him to say, well, I'm invading.
Yeah.
But you have to put it in context of, we closed all the other diplomatic doors where he wanted Ukraine to be neutral and not part of NATO, not to have an aggressive foreign power that from the 1970s onwards has been focused, or long before that, been focused on destroying the Russian power. And that takes no account of the fact that, 2014, there were lots of ethnic Russians who said, well, we want to be separate from Ukraine. So there are complications.
Yeah.
And those people have been in Sevastopol and been in the Crimea and been in the Donbass for a long time. And if some of them said, well, we don't want to be part of Ukraine, I wasn't there. Maybe that whole thing was made up, but I doubt the whole thing was made up. There was plenty of it reported, even in such rags as The Guardian.
Yeah. I think that's the problem, though, and I'm going to annoy you again, because I'm going to...
Good, that's what you do best.
Because I'm going to talk about Israel and Palestine again. The media, they're like a polarizing attitudes of people, because it's the ways that we live. We take that as guidance of what we should be doing, and I find it very hard to... No, I don't want to sort of say take a side, but to understand as far back as you can go. And the same argument is there, and you sort of said it, who was here first? And it's like, well, how bloody many years do you want to go back?
And there's also as if that was the deciding factor.
No, it's not. And
who was where first? Who was nastiest first? Who's been the nastiest?
Yeah.
As if that then... okay, well, we've sorted that out. Instead of saying,
nothing's getting sorted out.
Tractable tragedy here, and what you want is not to blame people for the past,
no,
cleansing as that might feel, but to try and find a way of lessening the bloodshed in the future.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get drawn into Israel. I'm sorry, no matter how hard you try. We can. I'm not. If you're feeling suicidal, we can do it in the future.
No, I'm not.
Let's just get back to relatively safe. The relatively safe minefield of Ukraine.
Yeah.
There is a more accurate analysis you can make. It's not one that gets you to an easy answer, but at least you are dealing with something close to reality,
And the closer to reality you can get, the better chance you have of coming up with the prospect of it finishing.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to understand what's going on in Ukraine, you have to look at the fact that there were 4 or 5 economic political clans, and who they have supported at any one given time has meant whether the West smiled on them or not. 2 of the big economic clans have been felled by the West. Firtash, he was arrested in Austria. And then Kolomoisky, who was the backer of Zelensky. It's interesting that Kolomoisky was just a little while ago suddenly put under house arrest in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And they nationalized his bank, which he owned Privatbank, which was the largest private bank.
Yeah.
It was the largest bank in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it happened, at around the time that the New York Times reported, they had an article, and then they said, that Kolomoisky has now said, who had been a supporter of rapprochement with the West, the New York Times said, Kolomoisky's now decided it's time to give up on the West and rebuild relations with Russia. The thing about Kolomoisky is he was, as far as I could see from the outside, and I'm willing to be corrected by, Ukrainian scholars.
Yeah.
He seemed to me to be the one who was less concerned with I'm pro-Russia or I'm pro-West, and was the one who said, I'm a Ukrainian nationalist, and I will switch sides depending on which one I think is going to be best for Ukraine at the time. But it's interesting that, suddenly they nationalized his bank, and they've accused him the way that you always accuse anyone that you want rid of politically of some kind of economic malfeasance. Every really wealthy oligarch in China that they want to bring to heel gets arrested and accused of all kinds of impropriety, which they may or may not have, been guilty of. And Kolomoisky is now under house arrest, and he's on trial in absentia in, I think, Cyprus and in London. Because I was down at the Central Court, the High Court, with Ranjan, who maybe we'll get on one day, and we were down there just listening in on the court case, where they're arguing about, did he siphon off this many millions or this many hundreds of millions or this many billions? But it's interesting that what you see is leaders and their oligarch supporters being moved around by, on the one side, Russia, and on the other, the Americans or the Europeans. And the Americans and Europeans don't always see eye to eye. I mean, the British have had such deep connections with Russian gas. The Tory party, was it Lord Risley and Lord Oxford?
Yeah.
Massively closely tied into Firtash, and they were on the board of the largest private gas company in the Ukraine.
Yeah.
So you have to delve to that kind of detail if you understand who's doing what to whom and for what reasons.
Yeah.
And it's not the idiot story we're being fed.
And how did the court case go?
Oh, it'll drag on forever. I mean, it made me think of Dickens' novel where they all go to court, and at the end of the court case, there is no money left because the lawyers have used it all. But it seems to me a sign that the West is signaling to Zelensky that you will have to knuckle under if we decide that the best way out of this is to come to a diplomatic accommodation with Russia and say, okay, maybe they'll say you get to keep the Crimea and the Donbass, or maybe they'll say you get to keep Sevastopol but not the whole of the Crimea, or maybe they'll say you don't get to keep that but you get to keep the Donbass. I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
But I think the fact that senior officials have floated the kite of maybe we need to do a deal with Russia. Of course, they were shouted down, but that's how you do it.
Yeah.
You fly it. It gets reported. Someone says, "Oh no, they misspoke," or "No," but they get handsomely paid for misspeaking. Someone has to fly the kite, and that's what they do. And the fact that they decided to take up Kolomoisky, Firtash went years ago because the Americans didn't like him because he supported the leader of Ukraine, which ousted their man, the Americans' leader. And Kolomoisky has been it hasn't been clear who he supported. But the fact that they've now decided to have a go at him, and I think is a clear message to Zelensky. Zelensky's going to have to rein in his own nationalists, and if he can't, he'll get thrown under the bus, I think. Because Ukraine's not going to win this war, and all of the stuff about how they've been on the cusp of winning it for months, surely by now people realise that was mostly just bollocks. Reported by the usual purveyors of the official narrative bollocks, people like The Guardian.
Yeah. No, I've been reading on things like TRT, the Turkish one, and Al Jazeera, but also in your favourite paper, The Guardian. Yeah, talking about how Russia is still overextended. But I don't think you can quite say he's not going to win. I think there's a few other things that might happen in the next 12 months. But
it depends. Surely it depends on how many more billions the American taxpayer is willing to fork out.
Yeah,
and that's already starting to get caught up in the presidential election. What was it?
Yeah.
Tucker Carlson, who doesn't like Trump but is right wing. He said, "Oh, so every city in America is worse off than it used to be. There's crime, there's deterioration, there's public services, and you're still worried about Ukraine not getting enough money."
Yeah.
So it's a clear sign that, if the American taxpayer can be induced to keep sending vast amounts of munitions and help, then maybe they will win. But I think it looks like it's becoming a World War I kind of stalemate. And then you're into I think what's going on is there's a certain group within the Pentagon and within their foreign office essentially running the line that we don't have to win this militarily, we just have to grind Russia down and it collapses from within, which was part of the argument they used during the Cold War.
Yeah. I'd
Just outspend them.
Yes, yeah, I can see there's. I mean, that's one of the options, is that something happens within Russia that dilutes the thing, and that's been my hope for a long time. But just to dispel, I suppose, a theory that I'm slightly worried about is the connections that Russia has with Iran.
Oh no, you're heading back to Gaza, aren't you? I can feel it now.
I'm going to have to get.
You're determined to get us shot by somebody.
No. I'm sort of saying, so with the connections that are clear between Iran and Russia and North Korea, there feels as if what's happened in Israel seems to be, right, the Americans have sent their big aircraft carrier and multiple support vessels along with that little show of strength. Kind of feels that would be good for Russia and Putin in terms of the Americanized slightly being taken off, and maybe that will hit the financial argument that you were suggesting.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No.
I mean, do us throw China into that equation as well? I mean, it's a strengthening of that pact, isn't it? The BRICS, is it? So you got Russia.
Yes,
Iran.
but okay. Like I said, you're determined to get a shot by someone. Okay, look, the way I would see that is there's a world of difference between saying this could help Russia. That doesn't mean they or Iran are in any way engineering it. I don't think you should imagine the big hand coming out of Iran and strings going down into Gaza. I don't think it's that simple. I agree with you that the Russian Foreign Service might look at this and go, okay, this is quite nice. Because, I mean, one of the things is, as far as I know, and I read this a little while ago, that, Israel's Iron Dome defense, the anti-missile thing, as far as I know, they are low on supplies for the Iron Dome.
Yeah.
And I think certain parts of it, maybe important parts of it, have to be supplied by America.
Yeah.
So that would mean that America would have to start pumping more money into there, because I think Hamas still have quite a lot of missiles left, and God forbid that Hezbollah got involved. There's the specter of even inaccurate, not very deadly missiles could overwhelm the Israeli missile defense, and then America would get involved, and that would be an even greater drain. And certainly someone like Trump would say, why are we constantly fighting all these wars at the taxpayers' expense?
Yeah.
So in that sense, but I don't think that means that in a smoky room somewhere in the Kremlin, Putin or anyone else has been engineering this, nor any mad mullah in Iran.
I wouldn't say engineering it. I just I feel as if there is there's tentacles there.
Well, what do you mean by they can see that it's going to play into their interests. I don't necessarily think that means that they're actively doing something. I mean, maybe they are. I mean, it's just so complicated because, okay, you can make an argument for there being an interest from those countries, but similarly, you can make an interest from an argument that there would be massive interest for all of the other Middle East Arab nations who really don't want the burden.
No, they don't. And you were talking about the Chinese involvement in Qatar.
Yeah, I mean that's a clear example of how your tentacles idea, how far it stretches. For a long time, Qatar was a country that had adverts on the television and fly Qatari Airways and have global sporting events over here, and everyone's happy.
Well, and not everyone.
Well, okay, but suddenly, Saudi says Qatar is a rogue state, and they seal their border, and they try to cut them off, and it was reported everywhere. And I don't remember anyone saying, "Wait a minute, how did that happen? 1 minute they're a friendly nation, the next minute they're a rogue state. What happened?" And what I'd noticed, because I was interested for other reasons, but even if someone hadn't been following it like I was, 10 minutes on a search engine would have found that a few months before this sudden surprising declaration by the Saudis, the thing what had happened is Qatar had signed an agreement for, I think it was 30 billion, to set up in Qatar a clearing bank where China and anyone else could buy and sell gas not in dollars, but in yuan.
Right.
And the coincidence seems to me to be stark, because obviously the American economy really does pivot on everyone needing dollars to buy oil and gas.
Yeah.
That's how America can run such massive debt, because regardless of how much debt they've got, everyone wants dollars because they need to settle so much international trade.
Yeah.
And so, Qatar and China make this announcement, and suddenly the sky falls in on Qatar. And I don't know if that clearing bank is still there.
And that also helped Russia as well, didn't it?
Yes,
oil.
In the sense that a lot of these nations want to stop using the dollar as the settlement currency. I mean, it's still the reserve, the world reserve currency, but it's been quite clear for a long time that there's been a little club of nations, notably Russia, China, and Iran, have been getting lots of pieces in place since about 2010, maybe before, which included buying lots of bullion and talking amongst themselves, trading directly between their currencies to avoid the dollar. And there was the strong suspicion that they were aiming to either set up a petro-yuan in competition to the petrodollar, or to create some new settlement currency.
So this is part of the BRICS, so including Brazil and South Africa.
I don't remember whether Brazil and South Africa were involved in this sort of series of negotiations that was going on about settling trade. It was a whole series of bilateral agreements between Russia and Iran.
But I think that the big thing for me is as you step back on this and step back from and see the wider picture, you are seeing these tentacles and maybe, and I don't know whether I have no answer, but maybe this is pointing to something bigger that's happening overall. That's kind of, I suppose, my gut feeling.
Well, I mean, I would agree that at least one of the bigger things, I mean, obviously the big thing is the jostling for power between China and the yuan and America and the dollar.
Yeah.
But certainly it's been, as those clips we played earlier show, it's been a long-standing foreign policy obsession of America to destroy the global power and influence of Russia. First when they were the Soviets, now that they're Russia. And so that's constantly going on.
Yeah.
And again, as those clips showed, they were a focus of that was they saw Russia undermining American hegemony in Europe, separating America's European allies from America by using the fact that Germany, Austria, and lots of other countries were becoming reliant on Russian gas, which from the Russian point of view was just free trade, and from the American point of view was foreign policy. And so they waged economic warfare. So in that sense, sure, of course there are bigger things going on. And that's part of what you need to keep your eye on if you want to understand any of this. Instead of just going, Putin's a horrible man who wants to take over the world and invade everywhere, and the Americans and the Europeans are just lovely people who care about human rights.
Well, would you like...
if you go down that path, then you're Class A1 moron.
Yeah, no, but there's plenty of them, and they're showing their faces more and more these days. But just out of interest, would you like me to throw in Yemen and Eritrea as well while we're in?
No. I mean, if you have no regard for your personal safety, I do. And if you really want to discuss all of these, because the whole Gaza and the Middle East is just so much thornier and more ingrown than even Ukraine, then we can at a later date. But let's not do it all at once. We're getting enough trouble for this.
David's a drunk.
Well, I mean, we'll talk again if I'm still here.
Thanks for that, David.
Yeah, mate.
And thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed that, then yes, ask some questions. Enter into the debate. We are on Substack, David Malone, Hyperland. And wherever you receive your podcasts, we would both be delighted if you could leave a review. Thanks for listening. Cheers for now.